Today I'm going to be testing some cold, hot press and rough watercolor papers with a sea salt technique I often use, and I'll do this test in two parts. For the first part I'll test three of the papers. I'm going to start with just drawing outlines, blocking in some basic tones. I'm going to use no reference at all and just do a generic sort of rhinoceros eye, which will show off the pebbling texture I want to achieve with the sea salt. I'm just laying in some basic block tones. I find with sea salt, if there's a variety of pigments underneath the salt, the patterns are just a bit more sophisticated. I'm dropping in more colour, adding second scatterings of sea salt. When you're adding sea salt, you've got to put it down when the paint is absolutely fluid and wet. If you even let the paper dry to satin, waiting even maybe 10 seconds, the salt just really sits on the surface and doesn't take up much texture at all. I've put the salt a little bit late on the second from the left on the right, which is the Stonehenge Aqua. That'll probably come back to bite me. The second from the left on the bottom row is Saunders Waterford. I've put on paint. It looks quite dark when you first put it on Saunders, but it always dries quite a bit lighter. The last two swatch samples I'm not going to complete. The first one is Stonehenge Aqua. I've already roughed out some texture detail areas with glazing. You can see the stippling effect of the sea salt. It hasn't really made the starburst pebbling patterns that I like, because I put it on a little bit too late. I'm just outlining some fine wrinkle details. This paper, paint goes on glossy smooth, a little bit slippery on the surface. Water sits on the surface of this paper for a bit longer than other stocks, but it lifts incredibly well, and it takes fine lines really beautifully. It's a very satiny, quite smooth paper to work on, holds clean lines very well. It does allow you to glaze quite nicely over the top. And there's our finished sea salt test for Stonehenge Aqua. A pretty good stock all in all. The next stock I'm going to try is the Hanamura Cold Press 300. You can see the sea salt has taken much more readily to this paper, in part because it's a cold press, but in part because I put the salt on when the paint was very wet. I'm just blocking in some alizarin and Prussian blue to add depth, creating some wrinkle lines, adding some blooms, scraping the salt off. The blooms have taken quite well. The added sea salt didn't really add much more texture, just fine lining. I'm keeping to as close as possible the random patterns generated by the sea salt when I'm creating these pebble skin details. The sea salt adds a little bit of dimension to each starburst. It looks like a sort of topographical moonscape map, so I can use that topography and just enhance the pebbling that's already been created by the sea salt. For cold press paper, this takes fine lining and glazing extremely well. It's one of my favourites. And there's the finished Hahnemühle sea salt. The next I'm going to test is Canson Heritage. This is the hot press version. I quite liked the cold press version of this paper. It did not lift particularly well, but the hot press is lifting, certainly when the paint is wet, quite a lot better. And I was able to lift when dry as well, so all in all this is a reasonably promising stock. It did bleed a little bit when I was over glazing. And there are the three final pieces.